Live from the sun-drenched cobblestones of the Eternal City, conversation crossing faith, culture, and current events. Civil discourse, civil debate, and the free exchange of ideas. This is Intersections with Bree Dail and Matt Dooley. Now your hosts, Bree and Matt.
And good morning to a very busy morning, a Monday morning here in Rome. This is Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events with Bree Dail and Colonel Matt Dooley. For those of you who are joining the first time, this is a show that's focused on trying to bring Catholic culture and world news together. And I am an internationally accredited journalist, including accreditation to the Holy See as the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times. And you may also find me on Catholic World Report. I'm contributing to Newsmax magazine, National Catholic Register, and many other outlets. And I hold a BA in history from Christendom College and a master's degree from Norwich University. And today, our show is going to be broken down, like it usually is, into three themes: news impacting faith, connecting that to news impacting culture, and finally, news impacting current events. Good morning, Matt. I know that we were talking offline right before here on some of the big news, talking about the AI world, artificial intelligence and tech, which is a thing that we like to do. But can you, for those people who are joining the first time, kind of give your background a little bit so that they know who my co-host is?
Sure. I graduated from West Point in 1994 and served as an armored cavalry officer, spending about 21 and a half years at the forward edge of our foreign policy in the combat arm of decision. So now that we're past the propaganda, I spent the last part of my career working and developing a portion of the Army a lot of folks don't know exists. And that's that element of the Army that works on building the next Army and the Army after next. And we talk about capabilities, we talk about gaps, and we talk about solutions. Some of those are material and technical, some of those are organizational changes. But what I got involved with is robotics and AI, which really didn't have much of a precedent a few years ago, but now it's just really taken off. So right. I like to say we live in exponential times. And what we're trying to do across the board is look at technology, look at autonomy and AI, and ask, what should we be doing with it? What are its possible benefits, and what should be the policies that govern it? We spent 70 years chasing the consequences of splitting the atom. We would like to avoid chasing the consequences of releasing AI into the world without some regard to third and fourth order effects. So a lot of that, what you're seeing today, is folks in the UN, folks in NATO, across the world, describing what we want out of AI and what should be its limits.
So Matt, we're going to be talking about that likely the second and third part of our show today, because I think AI technology, this element, this area of expertise that we both have, a lot of people are getting into, but it's the Wild West right now. Technology that is not human-centered design versus human-centered design, and then some philosophies that are coming out, which are really odd as well, right? But before we do that, I want to kind of go over some of the news out of the Vatican this past week. And for those of you who are joining us, happy St. Nicholas Day. I've been seeing memes all this week of and especially this morning online of St. Nicholas punching the face of Arius, because everybody loves that story. So I myself posted it as well. But, Matt, what's interesting is that the Pope has been in Cyprus and in Greece this whole past week. And the mainstream media has really focused on a lot of the the words and engagement that the Pope has had, whether it has to do with diplomacy and, politics like democracy, whether it has to do with the situation in Greece with illegal immigrants coming into Greece and those who are claiming refugee status. And all of this is been in the mainstream media news. He has just returned to Rome just about a half an hour, 45 minutes ago. And news is now coming out on his press conference, which is always super fun, unscripted press conference on the planes with the press. I've not seen any of it yet. I'm not going to report on anything until I actually hear him and see what is, the videos that have him asking. I know that over the week, there was a lot of a to-do that was made, especially out of the conservative circles, of an Orthodox priest yelling at the Pope that he was a heretic. And, many in the conservative circles were like, yeah, get him, and it's very difficult to see that, especially because the history of the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church is pretty tense. And for people who don't really know, the Greek Orthodox do not recognize the papacy and do believe that those who are Roman pontiffs, not just this Pope, are heretics. Similar, similar vitriol was actually lobbed at John Paul II when he went to Greece. So this is not a new thing, but in this case, because there are people who do not like the person of this particular Pope, it seems like there are more than a few Catholics, and including Catholic media people, who were really promoting that. I find that very disturbing, Matt. There are other stories that are coming out, but I wanted to get your take before I provide some kind of background on some of these other stories that are kind of not being really discussed.
Sure. So, let's talk about 2,000 years of Christian history between Greek and the Latin rites. So we start there. There's a difference born of language. And so you see Eastern versus Western Empire. We're going all the way back to the days of Rome, and how we collectively, and I say we as Western civilization collectively, governed the known world. And so when you see a division there, there's a cultural background history to this that you have to take into account. And then we can talk about the Byzantine Empire. We can talk about the Holy Roman Empire. So there's a lot of water underneath that papal bridge that's flowed before we get to this point, this conversation we're having here. But my take on shouting heretic at someone may not be an example of dialogue that we need. There has to be some conversation. And I'm not saying that to minimize anyone's concerns. I'm not saying that to minimize anyone's questions, anyone's dubia when it comes to wanting some answers on things. But shouting at each other is not the same thing as conversation. And I would like to take a step back. Let's all have a conversation rather than accuse each other and point fingers, because that's not productive.
Yeah, a lot of people are pointing to St. Nicholas as punching the face of a heretic named Arius as another example. Why don't we have more of that? Well, this was over a council and over the dignity and the humanity and divinity of Christ, and it was heated. And people don't really remember that there were consequences to Nicholas doing that. He was actually imprisoned, and I think rightfully so, because punching the face of anyone, even if you are a heretic, it comes out of an emotional side, doesn't it? And Arius was wrong, and he was proven wrong, but he was proven wrong through theological arguments.
Precisely. That's the way I adhere. Is ultimately I want to see Christ's truth prevail, and that's going to happen through evidentiary discussion and the weighing of what true meaning is, rather than shouting at each other. That only leads to worse. So,
Matt, speaking about evidence and whatnot, we are seeing reports this past week, and I will be writing a report on this. Cardinal Angelo Becciu, who is on trial right now for the financial scandals in the Vatican, his team, his defense team, including all of the other lawyers in the defense against the Vatican right now, have made a massive statement, and I will be posting the entirety of it. But this statement was made because this past week, video, parts of the video of the deposition, the interrogation of the main witness for the prosecution, which has not been, for those who are understanding or have been following this story, the prosecution working for the Vatican to uncover financial scandals leading to corruption with a property in London. The prosecution has been ordered multiple times to provide evidence to the defense, evidence to the court. The prosecution has refused to do so and then has provided partial evidence and not full. And then 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing wherein, again, the defense said the prosecution has not provided full evidence, has doctored video. And on top of that, within the evidence that they did provide, there's question now to whether or not the Pope himself has been involved, because the prosecution said he was. And at that point, they have said, now we need to have the evidence of the Pope's, involvement into this case. That needs to be put into evidence. And the judge said, okay, we're going to postpone our ruling on this until next week, this next week coming up. And in the meantime, you are to provide the defense all of the video, like completely, the investigation, complete, no editing, nothing, right? And the prosecution said, Matt, and I quote, we're afraid that if we provide this to the court and to the defense, that it will be leaked to the press, right? Why would that happen? Why would that happen? This is evidence, right? And lo and behold, even though they still have not provided, according to the defense, they still have not provided the court the evidence, nor the full videos to the defense, portions of the video has been leaked to the press in Italy. So now the question is, what is the defense? I mean, what is the prosecution doing? And on top of that, Matt, like certain outlets like The Pillar are defending the prosecution still. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, why is the media, especially like the quote unquote conservative media, why are those particular people doing the prosecutor's work? This should be a concern for anyone when it comes to fair justice. I mean, whether or not these people are guilty, it does seem to be that the prosecution keeps dropping the ball. And like we discussed a few weeks ago when it came to, trials and prosecutors, all your I's need to be dotted and T's crossed when you're providing evidence against someone. And it just seems like the Vatican's representative is really dropping the ball here. Any thoughts, Matt, on hearing that now, like video evidence has been leaked to the press?
Yeah, I think what disturbs me is, here we go again with prosecutorial misconduct.
Right.
The whole thing about being a part of the system, about the apparatus that works to achieve justice, to ensure a fair result in a criminal case, is that you're not supposed to be a part of the story. That right. the trial, the accused, the alleged victim, those are the folks who are on the on-deck circle, and the trial, the case happens to be about. It's not supposed to be about you, whether you're a defense or a prosecutor. As the judge, as the jury, you're a part of the judgment apparatus, but again, you're not supposed to be a part of the story. So that's one element. The second element is, again, you hit on this often. What is the responsibility of journalism? To be a true journalist, you're there to provide the truth, which is fact plus context. But that requires some judgment and some professionalism to ensure that you don't cross over into editorializing and that you don't become a part of the story as well. So there are a lot of egos here and people who are a part of the story. They're muddying the waters. And I'm not sure, in this particular case, we're talking about financial corruption and the Vatican. In the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, where we're talking about the right of self-defense and the consequences of BLM doing what it does. These are issues.
We'll be back with you after this break to talk more about international news and news in the church. This is Intersections with Bree and Matt Dooley.
Can a moral relativist object to God's goodness based on the problem of evil? The answer is no, at least when it comes to moral evil, and here's the reason. You see, moral relativism states no moral truths exist independently of the individual. That's to say, what is right and wrong is relative to what the individual determines. Now, how can a relativist deviation from his own moral standard be considered morally evil when there's nothing to oblige him to follow his moral standard? The answer is, it can't. But if no moral evil can exist within the mental framework of moral relativism, well then obviously a relativist's complaint about the problem of moral evil is useless. So the relativist either has to give up the complaint about the problem of moral evil to keep relativism, or give up relativism to keep the complaint about the problem of moral evil. The relativist can't have both. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
We all know children have a natural innocence and a sense of wonder. Yet our world is full of distractions that can pull families in the wrong direction. But with the help of God and a church family, your children can grow in the security of faith, hope, and love. Weekly Mass provides that critical faith foundation needed in life. So if your family hasn't been to Mass in a while, we'd like to invite you home. Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.org.
And welcome back to an all-new Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events with Bree Dail and Matt Dooley. And our previous segment, we were talking about some of the news coming out of the Vatican, including this ongoing trial with Cardinal Becciu. And Matt, you were making a really good point, as we tend to do in this show, to talk a little bit about media's responsibility. We're in this segment, we're gonna hit some of the world news that happened this week, and I find it really interesting because the media in the secular world in the United States, but also internationally, turned on their own this week. We had a very well-known CNN kind of demagogue, I guess you could call, commentator, Cuomo, who was found to have tried to back up his brother and support his governor brother in investigation. And it ended up being that he was also accused, and CNN knew of this, of sex harassment. Well, he has been fired. So Chris Cuomo has been fired. Fredo, as some would call him, has been fired. But Matt, there's a little bit more to this controversy. I first want to get your reaction to this, because I know my reaction was pretty surprised at how quickly he went down. He must have had a lot of enemies within his, colleagues, to see even people in the CNN to really, get rid of him. But I've been told by certain colleagues over in DC that this may have been an inside, focus point from the Dems, getting rid of him, just because, I guess, the liability. Your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack with the Cuomos. He was the number one journalist for CNN. I used journalist with quotes around it, like my air quotes.
Right.
For those who are listening, I made air quotes with my fingers. The number one commentator, the number one talking head, the number one news, whatever. Taking that aside, you have the governor of New York at the time, who's his brother. Let's just say, for the purposes of argument, that he walked through an ivory tower and was cleansed of all sin and all previous accusations of sexual harassment or whatever, and he's on the up and up. Can he maintain an objective reportage about his brother?
Right.
Is that possible? To me, on its face, it should have been someone else doing the interview. It should have been someone else talking to the governor of New York, not brother to brother. Again, we talk about making yourself a part of the story. Were we talking about COVID? Were we talking about the performance of the New York governor? Or were we talking about two brothers slapping each other on the back, talking about how good of a job they both were doing? So that's one problem. The second issue is that apparently both of them had some issues with being a little grabby with people of the opposite sex.
Right.
And it's not the 1950s. The people, especially in the Me Too era, are going to speak up, and as they should, when it comes to people doing sexual assault and sexual harassment. And it would appear that there's enough track record, enough background, enough accusations with enough truth behind them, enough evidence behind them, that he became a liability. And so
Right.
CNN had to get rid of him. And that became more of a degree of scrutiny when his brother went down for the same thing. And we're talking about legal issues, critical criminal trials. So here we go. We're flushing, I think, long overdue to people that probably needed to stand accountable.
I would say that's 100% correct. That accountability is a big thing in the media, and unfortunately, there's been a lot of paths, I think, on both sides of the aisle for ideology. You know, Matt, one of the things that I'm hearing behind the scenes is that there is a very well-known, objective, investigative group that has been looking into allegations of sex harassment in multiple media organizations. Seems like this may be a problem. But shockingly, you know, one would think that after the Murdoch situation and Fox News and all of that went down, that there would be more, especially when it came to, you know, dealing with sex harassment, there would be more oversight in these outlets where your job is to be a public figure, you know. And my question is, Matt, I mean, public figures, they are held up to more scrutiny because they're public figures, right? I think that to whom much is given, i.e., if you've been given a platform, much is expected, right? One of the things that I have heard from my contacts is that this investigative group is looking at conservatives as well, and shocking some of the things that I'm hearing. And not only am I hearing the shock, like there's evidence to this. Now, I'm not going to be breaking any of these stories, I hope, because I think those that are looking into this are extremely good at what they do. But I would say I think this is tip of the iceberg. I asked that question. I do think it's tip of the iceberg. And it's not going to just be CNN. It's not going to be Fox News. It's going to be around the clock, people starting to be held accountable again, because it seems like this is something that is ongoing both on the right-leaning media as well as the left-leaning media. And this type of inner engagement, you know, shaking hands, kissing babies, that's what you expect in industry. What you don't expect is shaping narratives, using sources to try to get other individuals, and then sex harassment, trafficking, that kind of thing. And it seems like this is what we're hearing about. So what we've heard about in DC all of these years with the politicians, it seems to be the case also in the media. And maybe it's time for another Murdoch situation where we see big names flip, you know, and people be held accountable. But, you know, Matt, one of the things is that I've been watching too in the last week. You know, when we talk about manipulation, we talk about shaping narratives and whatnot. You know, Chris Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, they were really pushing how they did very well with the management in New York of the COVID crisis. And now what we're seeing is a new crisis come up. And we talked about this, didn't we? We've spoken about this too, the crisis manipulation. We have a new variant out of Africa. And right now, we know that here in Italy, we're starting to see shutdowns again. So one of the big things is that over Christmas and over the first of the year, they're closing down restaurants and cafes. That's going to happen due to COVID. You know, the Pope, before he left for Greece, said he was not going to be crowning Our Lady, the Immaculate Conception image, on December 8th because of COVID. Now, last year he said the same, and then he showed up last minute. And the thing is that people have to understand, in Italy, that is huge. It is a huge deal to every year to crown Our Lady. She is the patroness of firefighters, so it's just a really big deal. It's a big tradition, and even if you're not Catholic, for that particular tradition, everybody turns out. And so now the Pope is canceled again, and it just seems like we're seeing a new wave of manipulation. Now we've been told this past week by the mayor of Rome, that we are supposed to wear the masks outside when we're going shopping in the shopping areas, which has no scientific basis in it at all. So, I mean, Matt, are we going to continue to see these? When do we think it's going to be enough? Are we ever going to return to normal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we are, regardless of which side of the Atlantic you live on, I think we are at the saturation point when it comes to unexplainable actions that are not grounded in science. Folks are tired. And you have a whole spectrum of people, some who don't care about the science at all. They're just tired of feeling oppressed and locked down. But there are a lot who are asking really tough scientific questions, which is, if the masks and the vaccines and everything don't work, then why do we do them?
Right.
And if you're going to put me in a mask outside, what's the scientific justification for that?
Right.
About a year and a half ago, the scientists talked about the natural train and path of viruses is to mutate, and eventually they mutate themselves away from their most lethal variant.
Yeah.
So if you're in the middle of, the 1918 Spanish flu, eventually that went away because the next mutation wasn't lethal or as lethal. That's maybe where we are with Omicron, this current variant.
Right.
And it seems to be scientifically so that the South Africans are saying, look, this is it's got some modifications. We can see it, but it's gotten everywhere and it really isn't killing people anymore. So I think that the way ahead, to answer your question, is honest science. That if we can be honest with ourselves and say that we may have mutated ourselves out of the lethal variant, let's all go back to our regularly scheduled programming. Let's learn some things, that this wasn't a waste, that we did see some positive response from the medical community to quickly develop some vaccines. We've learned some important lessons about what not to do, but let's not overreact. There's a whole side of our population that seems to want to be in forever lockdown, and it's not economically reasonable. And in the long term, it's not good for our kids. And it's not good for people, and humans are social creatures. So we've got to find a way ahead that's better than a knee-jerk lockdown every time a new variant arises.
Matt, I also put out a video that was from the 1980s. I think it was maybe 1987. Perhaps it was 1983. I'm not 100% sure. Don't quote me. I did source it. But it was an interview by a very young Dr. Fauci on ABC talking about the HIV virus and AIDS. And at that point, he was saying on national television that those who lived in vicinity of people with AIDS may come in contact with them and may actually get AIDS through, close contact. And here he is saying this, which led to him and others in the medical community who are experts advising the media, and something very new, led to then panic that I believe was one of the reasons why people like Ryan White, if you remember, he was the hemophiliac child. He was ostracized, quarantined, was not permitted to go to school, had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court in order to be admitted back into school. That is what we see when you fearmonger and you speak on authority as a medical expert on things that are still developing. And that's what Fauci has done now. I think it's demonstrably so in the last few years, speaking on authority and not learning the lessons, and then going onto media programs and continuing to go on media programs and saying, we just need to get the vaccine. Once people are at 70% vaccinated, then we know that we're going to be okay, to now saying, oh, you're definitely going to need to get a booster every year, So, this is something that I think people have to hold accountable as well. the medical community to the science and the media to objective reporting. And it does seem that a lot of the media has chosen to turn to non-objective, very subjective reporting and propaganda. You know, Matt, yesterday or this morning, actually, I posted or retweeted a video coming out of Israel showing Palestinian protesters, including children, being staged. We know they do this, but it's just another example. The press being staged for propaganda from the Palestinian side, saying that the Israelis had fired upon Palestinian protesters. What kind of, when you see that type of propaganda and it gets out, what does that do to the cause, Matt? What does that do to the narrative? Does it undermine the narrative that is trying to be pushed by the Palestinians? Because we know that there has been humanitarian concerns in the past by the strong arming of the Israelis at times. So does that actually help in the legitimate concerns that are there when you start to see this type of propaganda? And why is the media, do you think, complicit in that?
Yeah, I think what you're looking for is a big truth reveal. We know that governments will use propaganda for their own purposes, and the danger in staging things and creating, Potemkin villages or contrived events with carefully lighted and choreographed events is that you build a house of cards of your story and your narrative. And it's got to be solid, because if someone gets behind the curtain and actually sees what you've done and it's just a facade, everything collapses as far as your credibility. The most salient thing I can think of with regards to, our era when we were kids, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was this monolith. We lived in a superpower competitive world, two superpowers, and who had the better narrative. And everything was about who got to the moon first, or who had the greatest legitimacy, or who was the most powerful, who had the most nuclear weapons. But then Chernobyl happened.
Right.
The 1986 disaster, and what then was the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and it caused everyone, including the Soviet people, to question the narrative that perhaps the Soviet Union wasn't the all-powerful science lead, that they weren't all-powerful in their ability to deal with problems, and that as the problem got worse and they did the investigation, they found out that the reports initially about the magnitude of the disaster were hidden at the cost of hundreds of thousands of people in the immediate area. And if you're anywhere in Western Europe or Southeastern Europe, there's a lot of radioactive material because of it. It burned for 9 days before they got it under control. And so when you have another example of a narrative that goes wrong, and it turns out that perhaps you aren't as suppressed by the Israelis as you've led people to believe, or perhaps you're not as powerful and as morally clean as you may want the rest of the world to believe, China, that once the truth comes out, you lose the ability to regain trust. And that's the real danger. And if you're a part of the media complex, playing that game, being played, being co-opted by the government to push their narrative, if you become a propaganda arm for the government, then you lose your credibility too. And people will turn the channel.
Or anyone, and I think that we're seeing that in a mass scale against the mainstream media because of the obvious patterns of this type of thing. But it also is happening in Catholic media, whether right or left. We are seeing very clear signs of propaganda versus objective, reporting. Matt, one of the things that I find really interesting is over the weekend, some kind of staged event took place, and it was mind-boggling to me how very quickly those on social media took down this narrative. So for those who were not watching on Twitter in particular, but I think it also made it to Facebook, there was an account that was created just a few months ago, supposedly a female, supposedly a journalist reporting on a group of conservatives who were protesting at the nation's capital. They all were in khakis. They all had American flags. Some of them had like, you know, weird, you know, outfits on top of that, like knee pads, for example, and like it was just, but they were all in uniform. They all were wearing khakis, all wearing the same thing. Looked very, very coordinated. And supposedly they were there to protest to retake the Capitol or something like that, regain our nation or something like that. Well, very quickly, social media, because the journalists, many people were jumping on it, but social media, regular Joes, you know, IT types, started digging in and saying, wait a second, this particular account was just created. Oh, the face of this girl looks like it was AI meshed and generated, so she doesn't even really exist. You know, these people look too fit and too uniform to be like, oh, regular Joes. It seems like this may be glowing, i.e., FBI, CIA, you know, hey, come over here, like, come, you know, do something in the way of like, you know, joining with us, you know, the crazy right wingers, so we can create some kind of chaos. And people almost immediately started to point to the FBI. Matt, why do you think that is? Let's say it was like an actual group. Why is it that it seems like the conservative side and even those who are middle to right and even some who are middle left leaning are really, really distrustful now of agencies in general?
I think it's because you're seeing repeated incidents where they're getting caught doing this, either trying to foam up and inflate in order to create an incident. And I don't know if the wisdom behind that is because they think by precipitating an incident, they can scoop up a group of true radicals before they actually commit and get organized.
Right.
That's the only thing that makes sense to me. Otherwise, it's entrapment. Or worse, it's a propaganda element, an arm of the government attempting to create an incident so they can go further in rooting out political dissent. That's something that we don't do in representative democracies. That's something that other governments, totalitarian dictatorships, do that stuff. We don't do that. And that's what I have a problem with.
And yet we do know that agency and military, we've done it. And we've done it for a while. I mean, I could just say like, I'd also say if we want to take a look at like Operation Mockingbird or Project Mockingbird, utilizing, you know, infiltrating the media in order to push propaganda, that was agency led. So, and that's proven.
Yeah, so, you're talking about the difference between public affairs and information operations. Your PAO, your public affairs office, can't lie to the American people. Information operations to shape competitors or shape theaters of operation, those are different. And it is a gray area in attempting to not cross the streams. I'm glad I don't do it for a living.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you don't want to come across as betraying and lying to your own people. That's not how we're supposed to do business in the West. But, you know, in this age of new media, this age of everything on the internet is forever, the age of the unblinking eye of amateur journalists, you're going to get caught quickly.
Yeah.
You mentioned this group of people in the Capitol. There was a similar attempt by a group of Democratic activists to look like, you know, MAGA tiki torch people going to a Glenn Youngkin rally to attempt to show racist supporters or white supremacists. And within minutes, 8 of these people were called out as Democrat operatives and being part of a sabotage effort. And that backfired in less than 2 hours. So if you're going to play that game, recognize that in this new age, you're going to get picked out for it and called out.
And it undermines the messaging. That's one of the things that I've been trying to push, Matt, in the last few years, is that in Catholic media in particular, but it's in larger media as well, there is one side, Matt, that says God is dead, or, you know, the faith is relative or subjective to you or whatnot. And we know that side. That side has never hidden that fact. That side will say that's their truth and that you have your truth. and I have my truth, and the truth is subjective and relative, right? There's another side. That side tends to lean right, and they say, no, truth is objective. He has a name. His name is Christ. And
Yeah.
we must submit to him through reason and knowledge and civil discourse and philosophy and all of that, right? Through ethics, right? What happens, Matt, and we are going to be going to break, but what happens, Matt, when those people who are supposed to be serving the truth choose to then try to play the similar game as the left, where the ends justify the means? I find this oftentimes happens with people who are involved in ideology. So, and where does ideology come from? You have the idol set up the golden calf. This is not new. Moses broke his tablets because of the ideology and not the proper worship of God, right? They looked at something other than the truth, right? And it was subjective. What happens, Matt, when we start to see that game being played on the right? Does that give the opportunity to those who say that the truth is subjective to completely undermine what, I guess the objective is, which is the truth? Do they get that chance? And what happens if people who are in the, who lean towards objectivity or the object truth, what happens if they get themselves involved with living a lie? Their lifestyles don't reflect. And we were talking about the Cuomos. The Cuomos, I would say, probably lean towards more truth is subjective. But Matt, your thoughts? I mean, what happens in the Catholic world if media starts to play games like that from both left and right? What happens to the truth, which is what we hope to be serving within the Catholic Church? 1 minute.
Yeah, I think once you give up your moral high ground, once you give up your moral rudder, the virtues, the convictions you stand on, in an attempt to, and the ends justify the means, to sort of play the game, play the way that your enemy does, that your psychological competitors do, then you're pulled off and you're down in the mud with them. And so that's the real danger. If you're going to go do that, you've got to understand why you're doing it. And you've got to understand what it does to your credibility. Otherwise, don't do it. And that's been, I think, the argument for some 2,000 years.
All right. So when we return, we're going to be talking all things tech. Are journalists relying on AI tools? And the creepy robot of the week, we're going to be talking about that with Matt. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.
A popular objection to Jesus' resurrection is that it's merely a ripoff of pagan myths about resurrected deities. Should this be a cause of alarm? I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. First, Christians couldn't have copied from pagan myths because the idea of resurrection as a new embodied life after death was foreign to the pagan worldview. Recall how the Athenians scoffed at Paul's preaching on the resurrection in Acts 17. Second, the majority of the alleged parallels are bogus. The deities never really rise from the dead. The spirit of the Greek god Attis entered into a pine tree after his death, and the Egyptian god Osiris merely reigned as king of the underworld. So to my Christian friends, no need to fret. Our belief in Jesus' resurrection didn't come from pagan myths. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Years ago, when I started acting, modeling, and singing in Mexico, my Catholic faith was not the center of my life. It took me many years to discover that success, fame, money, and all the pleasures of the world were not going to fulfill me. I got to a point in my life where I thought I had everything, but I realized something was missing. Thankfully, I began a faith journey that brought me back to God and home to the Catholic Church. You can too.
Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.com.
And welcome back to Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. I'm Bree Dail. With me is Colonel Matt Dooley. And in our first segment, we were talking about some of the news coming out of the Vatican. Don't fret, I will be reporting more on the Pope's visit to Greece as we start to hear from his press conference on the airplane. Always a fun time for those of us in the press. But Matt and I are turning now to some cultural things because I know people are really interested, Matt, in your views in the tech world. But before we get into the creepy robot of the week, which we have a video on, I just wanted to mention I had a discussion. There's a new thing on Twitter called Spaces where you can actually involve yourself in communicating, speaking, and being on stage with a whole bunch of experts and other people from all over the world. It's really great. It's like a group call, but it's in this space. You create these spaces. And I was in a space talking about AI tools, tools that are currently active. And one of these tools allows for you to find generated quotes or create generated quotes based off of historical data, things people have said in the past and whatnot. You can create a new quote for people. Now, supposedly, there are people who are generating these quotes, attributing them to someone who it sounds like. So like, let's say Martin Luther King or, a judge or whatnot, attributing these quotes and giving them to journalists, and journalists are using them. Now, Matt, do you see where this could go really wrong, especially when it comes to, journalists not double checking their sourcing, and people claiming that this is something that was said by someone? What happens if that person never said that, which it seems the AI tools are doing? Matt, any idea?
Yeah, I'm going to quote Abraham Lincoln here, is that you shouldn't trust everything you read on the internet. I don't think technology will ever replace the obligations of good journalism.
Right.
You've got a really good source, you've got a really good quote, you've got a really good nugget. How do you back check it? The way I used to do my information gathering on anything is have 3 corroborating sources that are trustworthy.
Yep.
If you've got 3 good sources who give you sort of an intersection point of where the truth actually is, you've probably got a pretty good piece of information. It takes some time. It takes some due diligence. And if you're short a verifying source, go find someone and get their perspective to see what they say. And you may have to write something that is not nearly as juicy as it would have been because you just can't get it there. So if we're going to add AI to this, if AI is going to go look into the internet and pull information, garbage in, garbage out.
Yes.
If you're just letting it free roam and pull from corrupted data source, where there may be some good stuff in there, but there may be some wholly inaccurate information in there, be advised what your AI is going to spit out is just what it got. It doesn't have the nuance yet. It doesn't have the critical thinking yet to be able to discern what's a probable quote from an actual source and what's something maybe from Abraham Lincoln, who wasn't alive before the internet. So there's a word of caution here if we're going to use AI to do that. AI does have some utility if its algorithms are designed to give you estimates, decision-making aids, to give you some discernment, but it's not a decision maker. And you as a journalist are a decision maker about what you publish. So you're never going to be absolved of that responsibility.
I can't even imagine just like taking a quote, attributing it to someone that person never said that quote. I mean, the loss of credibility is one thing. Like being sued for defamation or for plagiarism is quite another. And there are journalists supposedly doing this already. So what my advice is to our listeners is my mantra, which I will repeat again: never trust, always verify. That includes myself. Keep me accountable to the truth, because at the end of the day, it's not about me, it's about the report. So Matt, I want to share with those who are watching online, and for those of you who are not watching online, you're not going to see it, but the creepy robot of the week. Our producer is going to play this very creepy robot. I'll try to explain what we're seeing while we're watching. So we're seeing this newly engineered robot, Matt, wake up and have this facial expression of awe and wonderment as it starts to look at its hands and starts to recognize its hands and have self-awareness. Wow, we now have this facial expression of awe and looking at his hands and self-awareness, and his eyes are moving. And now he looks at us at the camera, shocked and awed, and self-awareness looks at us directly, has this kind of face, and then he's like, oh, hello. And this smile, which is also creepy. Matt,
Yeah.
why shouldn't we burn this with fire?
Well, a couple of things. Engineered Arts is a company that's been working on developing the ability of a robot to provide human expression. And there are all kinds of uses for a face that has expressive eyes, and then
do tell what's the use of that, Matt?
Well, animatronics. Think Disney World. Think in areas of customer interaction. If you need a concierge in a hotel, and we're in COVID-22, and you can't have a person sitting there at the desk, you want someone to interact with customers as they come in. You can have a robot there that looks like Robbie the robot, or you could have an autonomous entity sitting there that looks more expressive like you or me. Is that evidence of intelligence, or is that just evidence of it being able to mimic human expression? What Engineered Arts is working on is developing robots that can mimic human expression.
Is it recognizing itself? Do you see it like looking at its hand? Is it having self-awareness, Matt?
Well, it certainly looks that way. But you could program robots to move in a certain way and express a certain way. And so what I look at when I see that is a robot that's just going through a series of movements. And so yeah, it's convincing. It looks like it's recognizing itself, but I can't tell you whether or not it's actually truly recognize its own hands unless I spent some time in the room with it and watch it just randomly interact with random stimuli.
What would happen if it recognizes its own hands? Do we say that's like a self-awareness, that we start to question whether or not it's artificial intelligence learning from artificial intelligence, and because of that now it's no longer really a robot, but now has it's a created thing, a living thing with self-awareness? Because self-awareness is one of the key elements of recognizing an intelligent being, right?
Yeah, that's what you're asking is a really, really, really good question. We have to have the answers to, and the policies for, the rules for, before we create it, because the responsibility once after you've created it makes it messy. And that's the stuff of science fiction. But science fiction is becoming science fact in a lot of areas. Yeah. And so you're seeing some policies about AI coming out from UNESCO, the conversations at NATO from the military side, the conversations the U.S. military is having, the conversations that folks at Google are having about what's the responsibility and the true definition of ethical AI. And these are good conversations. Because candidly, you can't leave it to the Hollywood conversation of Terminator and Skynet and things like that, because that's not productive. It's scary, and we don't want to be exterminated as a human race. And once that's injected into the conversation, then you're emotional and you're fearful. This kind of conversation has to be very deliberate.
That was one of the reasons why my reaction the first time I saw it was kill it with fire,
Yeah, and you can't, I see two different reactions, really. There are people who are horrified by it, but there are other people who want to anthropomorphize every robot they ever see. Can I give it a name? Can this be my pet? And there are some cultural differences as well. Like, the Japanese, for instance, want to make the robots as human-like as possible.
Right.
Whereas in the United States, it's more, let's keep it mechanical, so it's very clear this is a robot, this is human. But you only see this kind of thing, what we saw in the video.
Why do you think that is, Matt? And we have 3 minutes, but why do you think there is a real desire on the West to not get to that point? Is it because we know that the science is there and that scientists if left to their own devices, oftentimes try to push as far as possible the technology, which we saw as a result in the Nuremberg trials what that was. Again, we talk about ends justifying means. The end is, can we create life without God, right? Involved, obviously, God being the center of the intellect. Human beings can't do that just by nature, because intellectually we have the ability to create. But 2 minutes, Matt, why do you think there's a limit there? There's a desire to separate.
I think this is my educated opinion based on my own technical expertise. And in the West, I see robots more used as teammates, as utility tools. And because of that, there's more of an emphasis on what can they do to make a job easier or to enhance a capability. Whereas in Japan, for example, robots may be more suited towards replacing human beings in certain things. And so they want human capability, relatable capability in their applications more so than we do. Either way, it's fascinating, but I do agree with the need to have rules in place before AI truly becomes, its own independent cognizance. We're not there yet, and we're probably a long way from it, but we got to have the rules first.
For those who are listening, thank you for joining us this week. This is Intersection Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. If you have a topic that you'd like Matt and I to discuss in our next segment next week, please shoot us a text message, direct message me on social media, Facebook, send us an email. We're really open to having these discussions, and especially when it comes to tech or the military or other fun topics, we're always there for you. But for this week, we're going to close saying God bless, happy feast of St. Nicholas, and we'll see you next week.